It is my pleasure to introduce Zach Schafer, who is Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Maryland Department of the Environment. Zach brings over 15 years of policy expertise, previously serving as Director for Special Projects and Policy at the U.S. EPA Office of Water. Zach has also served as CEO of United for Infrastructure and has worked previously on climate and water policy at the White House Council for Environmental Quality. Thank you, Zach, for joining us.
All right. Do you know which button it is? Just the big one. Okay. All right. Thank you, and good afternoon. I see the regulator stepped up to the podium, and everybody runs away. Thank you for having me, and just a big thank you to Mario and Gabelli Funds for having this conversation. I was here last year in my capacity as a Biden-Harris administration official, and glad to be here again this year as now at the state level, representing the Moore-Miller administration, and just really grateful that the financial community, the investor community, is leading and having these conversations because, as we'll talk about, it's really partnership across the public and the private sectors that's going to solve this problem. And so just thank you again, and thank you to Rosemary, to Rebecca, to Wayne, to the whole team for helping to make this happen. So I just wanted to start by just framing the conversation a little bit from where I sit now as a state regulator, but although these policy tools exist to a great extent at the federal level as well. This is a graphic I recently pulled together. It is a work in progress, so we can discuss sort of where things sit in the pyramid, and which are foundational versus which are aspirational at the top of the pyramid. But really, with this slide, I attempted to put together the universe of what are the levers that people in my position or in my department's position have to pull. And I'm sitting at the Maryland Department of the Environment. We're a regulator, about 1,500 different employees, inspectors, policymakers, enforcement and compliance folks. We have our own and some loan and financial investment tool folks as well. We have a number of different tools that we can levers that we can pull. And so, people come to us a lot of the time, and they might not understand what the levers are that we can use to address, PFAS or other issues. And so I just wanted to highlight sort of, how Maryland is approaching this issue. And this is not like we set out to build a pyramid. This is sort of my sort of post-game analysis of, how have we ended up where we are and what's working and what's not working. And so I think that, when you build a pyramid, you have to start at the base, and that comes, that's not going to start with hard regulations. It's not going to start with mandatory, with standards, with mandatory monitoring. It starts with, just discovering the problem, and it means investing in the science and in the research to understand both what are the risks, what are the hazards associated with something like PFAS, but also what's the scope of the problem. And so that's why we've been investing as much as we can at the state level in science and research, though there is no substitute for the kind of leadership that federal entities like EPA's Office of Research and Development have provided in the past on that. But then it's taking that science and research, taking the methods developed by EPA and others in the private sector, and doing voluntary monitoring, which you'll see we've really embarked on in a big way in Maryland, and then doing stakeholder education to understand the scope of the problem so that we can start wrapping our arms around it. Then we start to move up the pyramid. Thanks to active legislators in our state assembly, we do now have mandatory monitoring in a number of different areas. We've been directed to set action levels. Again, not standards, but levels that say, you should go in, if someone's exceeding this level for a certain contaminant, you should go and investigate further. You should think about where it's coming from, what the potential risks are, who might it be harming, what are the strategies that could be deployed to mitigate it, and look at it at a case-by-case basis before going and setting a standard that might work well for some entities but not for others. We're looking at things like individual permits. So this isn't a whole class of permits, but on a case-by-case basis, again, where there's higher risk situations, we can build PFAS and other contaminants like them into the permits, whether it's building in monitoring or building in limits or baselines. and then developing mitigation plans, which again is a case-by-case way to work collaboratively with a polluter or with an entity that may have been a passive receiver but still has, some level of discharge coming off of their site that needs to be managed. So we're working to develop mitigation plans. You go further up the pyramid, and the way I look at it is the further up the pyramid you go, the harder it is to get there, the longer it takes, the more political capital and actual capital it takes. And that's where you start to get to the big things like general permits, class-wide permits, standards, things like what the MCLs are at the national level, but at the state level, there have been states, as Rob and others talked about, setting standards for drinking water for years. But that's only drinking water. What are the standards going to be for wastewater, for air emissions, for landfill leachate, for other facilities like that? And then there's the funding piece, which is a hard fight. It's only in the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, that we saw the first dedicated large-scale federal funding to address PFAS in the water sector. That's just the water sector. Where do we get the funding to address it in land remediation? Where do we get it to address it in air emissions before it becomes a water pollution problem? And then at the very top of that, you have the conversations about banning or phasing out PFAS, which many states are starting to do. Either wholesale or in bits and pieces based on different types of products or product categories. And then, of course, there's the litigation. And really, I guess you could put litigation at any place in this pyramid. There's litigation from top to bottom and side to side. But thinking about the large-scale litigation against PFAS manufacturers, which states like Maryland are engaged on, and which we've seen in other states, really be the genesis for large-scale state funding and other action to address PFAS. So how does that lead to what Maryland is doing? And I'm going to breeze through most of these slides pretty quickly because I know Maryland, it's an important state, but it's only one of 50. But I think it's a good test case. I wouldn't call us, the median state when it comes to action on PFAS. I also wouldn't call us the bleeding edge of the community of states when it comes to PFAS. I'd put us somewhere maybe in the top quintile or so. But we're really starting to pilot things that are going to be replicated in other states, or that we are replicating because we have seen other states do it. So I think that this has national and regional and certainly and national lessons learned for what you're going to see happening around the country. The way I like to organize the thinking about this is into these three buckets. It's about getting upstream of the problem, which, as I think we all know, the fastest, the easiest, and the lowest cost way to address PFAS is always going to be by stopping it from entering the environment in the first place. I know that when New Mexico went out to sell their proposed product phase out, the Secretary of the New Mexico Department of the Environment would put a bottle of the old pre-PFAS phase out Scotch Guard on the table in front of him at a community meeting and say, if this were to spill outside, it could cost $18 million to clean it up, that one bottle. So it's really about thinking about, and it may be gimmicky, but the point resonates, that it is so hard to capture this and put it back in the bottle once it's out. So getting upstream, reducing the higher risk exposures, even if they are downstream, even if that is more costly, it's still critical to do to protect public health, and then to clean up and hold polluters accountable. And so to do those, we're doing things from tracking down the sources, and these are industrial dischargers, these are military facilities, there are firefighting departments, it's federal facilities, state facilities, local facilities, private manufacturers. We're looking at industry action levels and mitigation plans for dischargers that discharge into wastewater treatment plants. There are some early product phase-outs in Maryland that were put into law a couple years ago. We're looking at permits, both individual permits and starting to think about general permits in the state, and then moving to reducing those higher risk exposures. We all know about the drinking water limits, but then in Maryland, biosolids are a very hot issue. And what to do about contaminated sewage sludge from wastewater treatment plants. Fish consumption advisories are also an important issue. As any of you who visited the Chesapeake Bay know, blue crabs, oysters, these are part of the lifeblood of the Maryland economy and Maryland culture. So when people start to get nervous about what's in my food, whether you're a commercial fisher or it's part of your family heritage and how you find your protein, this is something that we get a lot of questions about and have to collect that data on, and then help people understand what are the relative risks and benefits of consuming those, of consuming contaminated food. And then we're also deploying funding through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to address PFAS and water infrastructure. And then toward the end of this, with holding polluters accountable, we are conducting investigations. We are using our enforcement tools to hold real violators accountable. But we're also working very collaboratively with some of them, where they never intended to release PFAS into the environment, and they want to find the source as much as we do because they live in that community and they drink the water from those wells. And so we're working very collaboratively with a lot of potential sources to hold them accountable and for themselves to hold themselves accountable and to clean up contamination where it's occurred. We have a few laws that have been passed at the state level that have really helped us catalyze action. It began in 2022 with what's called the George Walter Taylor Act. It's named after a firefighter who died of cancers that are believed to be linked to PFAS exposure through his work, through both the PPE, but also the combustion of contaminants that over the course of his life and career had some severe and adverse health effects. That contained a directive to create a state action plan. It looks somewhat similar to the EPA strategic plan, but focused on the state level. And it contained certain bans on, for instance, the use of aqueous film-forming foam and carpeting and food packaging that contained PFAS. And we're working now to begin the implementation of those, but running into some interesting challenges, which I'm happy to discuss later in the conversation. In 2024, the legislature passed a law to start addressing PFAS from significant industrial users. So these are wastewater discharges to wastewater treatment plants, which may contain higher levels of PFAS. And it created a monitoring set of requirements to do mandatory monitoring from those SIUs. And then we are on the cusp of setting action levels, again, not standards, but action levels, which will trigger a mitigation planning process with the department, with the wastewater treatment plant, who is the pretreatment control authority, and the discharger to that wastewater treatment plant to figure out what is the source, how can it be captured before it enters that wastewater treatment plant, because once it gets in, it's going to be really, really challenging to get it out of the sewage sludge and make it really difficult for that facility, for that wastewater treatment plant to dispose of that sewage sludge in a safe and responsible manner. There have been some further efforts. The session that we had this year, we have a short 90-day session every winter. There were some efforts to phase out PFAS that are active ingredients in pesticides. Yes, there are about 60 different PFAS, which are the active ingredient in pesticides. This is separate from the fluoridated container issue, which some of you may have heard about, where there's leaching from the container into the pesticide. But this is the actual mechanism of action for the pesticide itself. That one was withdrawn because the definition during the legislative process was corrupted and would only cover about 4 outdated pesticides, not the whole universe of ones that are actively applied. Similarly, there was a biosolids bill that would have set a sort of a ceiling of levels that are allowable in biosolids, and then directed our department to develop regulations that would establish levels that are the lowest economically and technologically feasible for biosolids. It was somewhat controversial. It was withdrawn. I expect it to get reintroduced this year, which is to say this issue isn't going away. And we've seen this issue expanding into neighboring states like Virginia and Maryland, and it's coming from states as well like Texas and Maine and New Mexico. So biosolids, and really it's what to do about those levels of PFAS in wastewater and in sewage sludge that's driving that conversation, and that's going to be a national issue moving forward. One of the last things that I did at EPA before I left on January 20th was to help get out the PFAS in biosolids draft risk assessment, which indicated that there are meaningful, and when I say meaningful, we mean orders of magnitude higher levels of risk associated with the presence of biosolids at the presence of PFAS in biosolids at the level of detection, which is 1 part per billion. So that's what we're grappling with in the wastewater space. I'm not going to cover these slides in detail because I want to get to just an opportunity for some questions and conversation. But the next few slides are just to show the range of work that we're doing across the agency. I came from Water World at EPA, so I've had to learn a whole bunch of new languages, working in the airspace, the land space, and the finance space at the Department of the Environment. But starting with water, which is where a lot of these conversations have really begun, we feel like we're actually ahead of the curve on meeting the drinking water standards. And while as someone who worked very, very, very closely and has the scars to prove it on the drinking water standard, and I would stand by the science and the process of the hazard index and the 4 other MCLs, In Maryland, fortunately, our non-compliance is driven by PFOA and PFOS. There's only one system out of 800 covered systems in the state whose non-compliance would be driven by an analyte other than PFOA or PFOS. So we feel like we're in actually a fortunate position with respect to what the regulation will continue to cover, but also with the timelines. Even with the timeline moving back to 2029, we still believe that we're on a track to have the impacted systems in compliance by about 2027, which is great news for the communities in Maryland who are identifying levels in exceedance of the drinking water standard. It also covers these smaller, non-transient, non-community water systems, which is an interesting conversation because these may be schools or hospitals or small cluster, trailer parks and mobile home communities. And so it's partly an education effort to get to them, to help them understand that this is something that they need to take seriously, that they will ultimately be required to do, but they're a little bit further behind the rest of the regulated community in the state because some of them chose not to participate in the early and voluntary monitoring that Maryland had embarked on a couple years before the rule was finalized. I talked a little bit about firefighting foam. This is an interesting area. We've all heard that this is a ubiquitous source of PFAS contamination in military installations, around airports, around firefighting training facilities. So this was one of the first, really the first product category to be addressed in state law in Maryland. And so we've begun the process of designing our take-back program. But one of the challenges we're running into is getting people to respond to getting companies to respond to our RFP to implement that take-back program. And so it's part of the regulatory process and the lawmaking process is understanding what is it we need to do, but then not understanding exactly what all the pain points are in the private sector where those capacities and those skills and those resources are to execute and implement these programs. And so it's been a bit of a collaboration and learning process with the providers to understand how we can move this program forward. I'm just going to quickly skip to the end here. I think I've covered at a high level these areas, but what this is to say that there are a lot of different ways that PFAS are making its way into Maryland's environment. It's through wastewater plant or through dischargers who are connected to wastewater treatment plants. It's dischargers who are discharging directly into the environment and have their own NIPDES permit. And so we're starting to think about what are the different tools that we have, going back to that pyramid at the beginning. What are the levers we can pull now? What are the levers that we can pull only with additional state authority? And what are the levers that are really going to be challenging for us to pull without federal action? And so I think that really leads me to just some key takeaways that I have from thinking about this and working on this now at the state level. One is whatever you think you know about PFAS, it's not the end of the story. And this goes back to the original risk assessments for PFAS that EPA did started at 400 parts per trillion, and then they went to 70, and then they went to essentially non-detect to the parts per quadrillion. The same is true for what analyte are you treating to? It's that addressing PFOA and PFOS is not declaring victory over PFAS, and I think that that's a trap that a lot of folks are falling into. That PFAS and PFOA and PFOS are almost being used interchangeably. And I remember when we announced the risk assessments for PFOA and PFOS and Gen X down in Cape Fear in 2022, we spoke with the utilities down there who started to get really concerned about PFAS because of levels of Gen X. But when they went to design the treatment systems to remove to non-detect levels, because there wasn't a standard at the time, they were just trying to get to non-detect, they realized that it was a different analyte that they hadn't even been thinking about that was going to be the breakthrough. And so the point is I feel like I get a new college education in something related to PFAS every month at EPA in this position now at MDE. And so I think that, as we think about what the standards are now, what we know about the science of it now, it's continuing to evolve. None of it in a particularly positive direction with respect to the health effects, but in a very positive direction with respect to our ability to treat it, and a very positive direction with respect to our understanding of the costs and feasibility of treating it. And one of the things that I've been really enjoying seeing is as new market entrants enter the space to address the problem, the cost of addressing it keeps coming down. And that's really opening the door to a lot of communities, a lot of impacted stakeholders to start taking action now, even though the science, the hard risk assessments on other analytes may not be there. It's becoming possible to start addressing them. One of the observations I have is that states can move faster but can't replace federal capacity and research. The breakup of the Office of Research and Development at EPA is of concern to me because the science that we rely on at the state level can't be done. We have one toxicologist at the Maryland Department of the Environment. EPA has divisions of toxicology. We can't do that science on our own. We also can't enter as easily into the kinds of CRADAs and research partnerships with private industry to test these and pilot these technologies as EPA and DoD and other federal agencies can. So, but state action can pave the way for federal action. One of the things that we saw at EPA was the fact that New Jersey and the New England states and California and Washington had set MCLs in drinking water and done a lot of that early research and done a lot of that early policy mechanism testing. That's what enabled us to move further and faster on the drinking water standard at the federal level. So it is a dialogue. It is a synthesis between the states and the federal government. Source control and downstream remediation, both are necessary. As I talked about near the beginning, we have to get upstream of the problem, and we also have to address higher levels of contamination at their source, even if it's not fair, even if it costs communities, even if it costs polluters. We have to address both at the same time. States are eager to pilot new solutions. We are doing this in Maryland. It can get hard, especially when you get to that community engagement phase. No community wants to be the guinea pig for testing out some new technology, but the alternative is worse. Doing nothing is worse. And so we are looking at ways that we can pilot with technology providers to do programs that, with appropriate safeguards, with appropriate monitoring, really do create the foundation of knowledge that we need, that EPA and others will need to take action in the future. And it goes without saying that greater public and private investment will be necessary. We know that the $10 billion provided in the IIJA is a drop in the bucket when it comes to this issue. There's money from the litigation that that is helping in certain states, but again, it's not going to be nearly enough. And so thinking about new and creative finance mechanisms and partnerships between the public and private sector to address this, not just in the drinking water space, but in the cleanup space as well, are going to be essential. And then just more partnership between the public and the private sectors. When it comes to developing the science, piloting what kinds of engagements work, and really figuring out how the state level, the private sector, and local communities where this is all playing out can work more effectively together. So with that, I'll stop there and I guess turn it back to you for questions.
Thank you, Zach. That was so interesting. Your perspective from both the state and federal level is really valuable. I wanted to open it up with a policymaking question. Specifically, we know PFAS aren't a new issue, but the policymaking and federal action specifically took on new urgency during the last administration. What do you think drove that progress, and how do you see that changing under the current administration?
It's a great question. Is this on? Okay. So I do want to give credit to the current and prior administration to the under Trump 1, as Rob said. Some of this work really did shift into a bit of a higher gear. There was a PFAS action planning process at EPA during the first Trump administration. So the work that we did in the Biden administration wasn't beginning from zero, and it wasn't happening in a vacuum. As I also said, it was happening, it was building on the shoulders of really important work that states had done. And so I think some states really did sort of push the envelope a bit. And Connecticut Water this morning was talking about how maybe some states the policy got a little bit ahead of the science. I don't know how much of that is the case, but they really did test the waters a lot on different policy tools for addressing PFAS in drinking water in particular. And so I think that it was the combination of the policy experience, the early planning that had been done, much more robust science that really came to fruition over the last few years. And then I really will say political courage and political will. Administrator Regan had dealt with this firsthand with Gen X in Eastern North Carolina as a state regulator, and he brought that lived experience to EPA, and it was a personal issue, as I believe it's a personal issue for Administrator Zeldin, coming from his experience here in New York. And so I think that, the more that we understand that this issue affects everybody, the more political will, I think, is brought to bear to really take action on it.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question. Having transitioned from the federal government to the state government, how has this changed your perspective on PFAS work generally?
It's a good question. It's interesting being at the state level where at EPA, especially at headquarters, it can feel very academic at times. It can feel very removed from the specific communities or projects that we're enabling, facilitating because of the policy decisions that we're making. At the state level, you're pretty close to that action. You're hearing directly from the communities. You are the one issuing the permit. You are the one who is advising a state legislator in real time on the implementability of a state reg. And understanding that that's going to have real consequences for both for protection, but also for cost, and navigating those is challenging. And Rob mentioned being a recovering regulator. I guess I'm haven't begun my recovery phase yet, but it's certainly an interesting position to be in, especially bringing a lot of the science and the drive and the passion that EPA had for this issue in the last administration, but then figuring out how to translate that into implementable, actionable, on the ground policy and decisions is challenging. But one of the takeaways I have at the state level is that you can actually get everybody in a room. You can actually get representatives from all the different sectors who are going to be impacted in a room and help. I think that there's information asymmetry, and there's just a perspective gap that I don't think all the different sides fully appreciate. And I'll just give an example. That when we were debating biosolids legislation during this past session that happened this winter, one of the provisions that the state legislators writing that legislation had put in was a hard cap. They wanted to put a ceiling in to say, like, no matter what regulation the department passes on economic and technological feasibility, there's going to be a hard cap of 50 parts per billion. And then there was another clause deeper down in the legislation that said, and the department shall add additional PFAS analytes to their regulations over time. And a lot of the utilities in the state read those two different things and connected, well, hold on, if the ceiling is 50, and yeah, you're starting with just PFOA and PFOS, and it sounds like that 50 is a pretty high bar, but then you start adding other analytes to the mix, that's going to be pretty hard for us to meet. And the legislators, the department, we weren't actually even noticing that that's a very valid concern. And so that's something that as the debate over this legislation in Maryland has evolved, that's something that it's just a consequence of getting in the room and talking with each other about how to address this problem, that we feel like there are solutions to those kinds of challenges. But until we got in the room with everybody and heard where the pain points were, we didn't realize that was a disconnect. So I think that at the state level, there is a real opportunity to iron out a lot of those issues. And then, like I was saying, at the federal level, you pick those balls up from the state, and they've ironed out some of those issues, not all of them. But it makes it easier to make progress at the federal level when the states have already been running the ball.
Thanks, Zach. We have about 30 seconds if anyone has a quick question. Otherwise, we can.
In regards to the $500,000 you set aside for firefighting foam, do you believe that it's going to be enough to solve the issue, or is that
No.
simply... Okay, thank you.
We do not believe that. That is simply what the state assembly set aside to begin that program. And we've been clear that a lot more is going to be needed, and that probably is a part of why we didn't get a strong response to our RFPs. And so we're talking to the providers in that space about what is realistic. But so a lot of this is, I think, that to Connecticut Water's point about the policy and the science and the economics. I'll add to that. Not always being in the same room with each other as some of these decisions are made can be just create roadblocks or speed bumps to deploying these programs. Would it have been possible if we had real estimates at the time to get the assembly to increase that level. We don't know. We're in a tough budget climate in Maryland, but yes, we fully understand the limitations of those resources. Yeah.
Thank you, Zach. This is a very interesting discussion and presentation.
Tony Bancroft and Timothy Winter, CFA, are portfolio managers. Wayne Pinsent, CFA, is Director of Research and Research Analyst, and Rosemary Morbelli, CFA, and Dr. Rebecca Stern, PhD, are Research Analysts at Gabelli Funds. The above webcast is a recording from the 3rd Annual PFAS Symposium, which occurred on September 17, 2025. GAMCO is providing these links as a matter of general information. We do not intend for these links to be a complete description of any security or company, nor is it a research report with respect to any of the companies mentioned herein. As of June 30, 2025, affiliates of GAMCO Investors Incorporated beneficially owned 1.1% of Minerals Technologies and less than 1% of all other companies mentioned. The analysts' views are subject to change at any time based on market and other conditions. The information in this posting represents the opinions of the analyst and is not intended to be a forecast of future events, a guarantee of future results, or investment advice. Views expressed are those of the analyst and may differ from those of other GAMCO officers, analysts, other employees, or of the firm as a whole. Because the investment personnel at GAMCO and our affiliates make individual investment decisions with respect to the client accounts that they manage, these accounts may have transactions inconsistent with the information contained in this posting. Certain GAMCO personnel may know the substance of the posting prior to its posting. This webcast is not an offer to sell any security, nor is it a solicitation of an offer to buy any security. Stocks are subject to market, economic and business risks that cause their prices to fluctuate. When you sell shares, they may be worth less than what you paid for them. For more information, a prospectus, or summary prospectus, visit our website at www.gabelli.com or call 800-GABELLI 800-422-355-4914, 921-5100, fax 914-921-5118, info@gabelli.com.